They said Margaret Hale's fire had gone cold the day her husband died, but on a wind-cut night in Red Creek, a stranger sat beside it like he knew the way back. The flames moved low and steady, licking the iron kettle hung over coals that hadn't seen company in 6 long years, and Margaret stood in the doorway with a rifle resting easy in her hands, not raised, not lowered, just waiting. Dust hung in the air, tasting of dry cedar and old smoke, and the man didn't turn when the boards creaked under her boots. Rick Callahan, though she didn't know his name yet, sat close enough to the fire that the light cut sharp across his jaw, but left his eyes in shadow, like something he preferred that way. He warmed his hands without hurry, palms open, fingers scarred from work that didn't ask permission. No saddlebags laid out, no request made, no apology offered. Just a man and a flame that wasn't his. Margaret's breath stayed quiet, measured, the way it had learned to be since the nights got longer without a second voice to answer them. Folks in town said she'd buried more than a husband out past the ridge. They said she'd buried the part of her that let people in. She let the door close behind her with a soft click, the kind that sounded louder than a gunshot when you hadn't heard it in years, and still the man didn't reach for anything, didn't turn, didn't speak. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, dragging sand across the porch like a warning that didn't belong to anyone. "You're sitting in the wrong yard," she said finally, voice low, even, not asking. The man shifted just enough for the fire to catch his eyes, and there was something there, tired, maybe, or older than the lines on his face. "Fire don't belong to a yard," he answered, quiet as ash settling. "Just keeps whoever sits close from freezing." It wasn't the words. It was how he said them, like he'd said them before, to someone else, somewhere far from here. Margaret didn't move closer. Didn't step back either. The rifle stayed where it was, a line between them that neither crossed. The kettle gave a soft rattle as the boil rose, and for a moment the only sound was water and wind and the small, stubborn crackle of burning wood. She watched him the way you watch a storm rolling in, measuring distance, guessing direction, knowing it might pass or it might stay. "Most men knock," she said. "Most doors open," he replied, and that almost sounded like a question, but not quite. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a loose hinge tapped slow against wood, back and forth, like time refusing to stand still. Margaret felt it then, not trust, not yet, but the absence of something she'd carried too long, a tightness in the chest that told her to end it quick, send him off, close the night again. It wasn't there. Not with him sitting in her fire like he'd been expected. She lowered the rifle an inch. Just an inch. Enough to change the weight of the moment. Rick Callahan watched the flame, not her, like he understood that looking too soon could break whatever thin thing had started to form between them. And in that quiet, with the wind outside and the heat between them, something shifted that neither one of them named, not yet, but both of them felt, like a memory trying to come back before its time. The fire settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that filled space without asking for attention, and Margaret Hale moved just enough to rest the rifle against the doorframe, not out of surrender but out of something harder to name, while Rick Callahan reached for a small tin cup near the edge of the hearth, as if he had seen it before, though he had not, and poured himself nothing, just held it in his hands to warm his fingers. A gesture that felt more like memory than need. The kettle began to hum, low and patient, and Margaret stepped forward at last, boots soft against the worn boards, closing the distance by inches that felt like miles, and she took the kettle from its hook with steady hands, pouring water into a chipped mug without offering it, not yet, then setting it down on the table between them like a test. Neither of them spoke aloud. Rick did not reach for it. Not immediately. He watched the steam rise instead, eyes following the thin white trail as it curled into the air and vanished, as if he understood that some things were not meant to be held too quickly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of a loose gate somewhere along the fence line, tapping in a slow, uneven rhythm that spoke of things left unattended, and Margaret glanced toward the window before catching herself, before remembering she had chosen this isolation, built it piece by piece after the world had taken more than it returned. "You planning to sit there all night?" she asked, voice quieter now, less edge, more weight, and Rick finally lifted the cup from the table, turning it once in his hands before taking a careful sip, like a man who respected what was given even when it was small. "Only as long as the fire lets me," he said, and there it was again, that way of speaking that made simple words feel like they carried something behind them, something he was not ready to show. Margaret studied him in the firelight, noticing the way his coat hung just a little too loose, the dust along the hem that spoke of miles walked or ridden without rest, the stillness in his posture that did not belong to a drifter looking for trouble, and yet did not belong to a man at peace either. "You got a place in town?" she asked, not because she cared, but because silence had started to feel different with him sitting there, less like protection and more like something waiting to be broken. Rick shook his head once, slow. "Passed through this afternoon," he said. "Did not find a reason to stay." Margaret let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, the kind that came when something unexpected settled into place, and she moved to sit on the opposite side of the fire, not close, but no longer standing guard, the space between them filled with heat and shadow and the faint scent of coffee grounds long gone cold. "Then you found one here," she said, more statement than question, and Rick did not answer right away, his gaze drifting toward the far wall where an old photograph hung crooked in its frame, a man beside Margaret, both younger, both looking at something beyond the camera, something that had not lasted. He looked back to the fire before speaking. "Maybe I did," he said, and the words did not sound like victory or relief. Just something acknowledged, like a fact he had been carrying long before he reached her door. The wind eased for a moment, leaving the night strangely still, and in that stillness Margaret felt it again, that absence of fear, that quiet shift inside her chest where suspicion used to live, and she did not trust it, not yet, but she did not push it away either. Somewhere deep in the dark, a horse stamped once, restless, and Rick's eyes flickered toward the sound, just for a second, enough for Margaret to see it, the awareness, the readiness, the part of him that never fully rested, and she understood then that whatever had brought him to her fire was not finished with him yet. She wrapped her hands around her own cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms, and for the first time in years, she did not rush the night to end. The night stretched wider than the land itself, and Margaret Hale found herself listening to the silence between sounds instead of the sounds themselves, the fire breathing low and steady while Rick Callahan sat across from her like a man who had already decided to stay without asking permission, and that unsettled her more than if he had begged for it. The mug in her hands had gone warm enough to forget, yet she kept holding it, as if letting go might bring the night crashing back to what it used to be, empty and predictable, and she had learned to survive predictable. Rick set his cup down with care, not a clink, not a scrape, just what meeting would like it mattered, and he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire as if he was reading something written in the flames that she could not see. "You always keep it burning this late?" he asked, and it was the first question he had offered, simple, quiet, but it carried weight because it crossed a line neither of them had named. Margaret did not answer right away. She watched the way the firelight moved across his face, revealing pieces of him, and then taking them back, and she wondered which parts were real and which ones he chose to show. "Fire keeps the cold out," she said finally. "And sometimes it keeps the past from walking in." Rick nodded once, slow, like he understood more than he should, and that was when something shifted again, subtle but certain, because strangers did not usually understand anything about her past, not without asking too many questions or pretending they already knew the answers. The wind picked up again, brushing against the cabin like a hand that could not quite reach inside, and Margaret stood, moving to the window, her reflection catching in the glass for a moment, a woman who looked older than her years but not broken, not anymore, not entirely. She checked the latch out of habit, though she had not needed to in years, and when she turned back, Rick was watching her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, just awareness, like he was paying attention in a way most men had forgotten how to do. "You planning to move on come morning?" she asked, and this time it sounded more like she wanted an answer than before. Rick did not respond immediately. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, something wrapped in worn leather, and he turned it once in his hand before setting it down near the edge of the table, not offering it, not explaining it, just placing it where the firelight could touch it. Margaret's eyes fell to it without meaning to, the shape familiar in a way that made her chest tighten just enough to notice. "Depends," he said quietly. "Some places ask you to leave. Others—" He let the sentence trail off, unfinished, like he did not trust it to land right. Margaret took a step closer to the table, the floor creaking under her weight, and for a moment the fire popped, sending a small burst of sparks upward, bright and gone in a breath, and she saw it then, the edge of the leather, the stitching worn in a pattern she had seen before, years ago, in a life she had locked away. She did not touch it. Not yet. "You carry a lot for a man passing through," she said, voice lower now, something underneath it she could not hide if she tried. Rick's gaze did not leave the fire. "Some things do not stay where you leave them," he answered, and that was not an explanation, not really, but it was closer to truth than anything he had said so far. Outside, the horse shifted again, hooves pressing into the dirt, and the sound echoed just enough to remind them both that the world had not stopped beyond this small circle of light. Margaret's hand hovered near the table, close enough to feel the warmth of the leather without touching it, and in that moment she understood something she had not expected to feel again, not tonight, not with him sitting there like he belonged in her silence. This man was not just passing through. And whatever he carried, it was already inside her home. Margaret Hale did not move her hand away, not yet, though every instinct she had built over the past 6 years told her to step back, to put distance between herself and anything that reached into her past without asking permission, and the fire cracked softly as if it knew the moment mattered more than either of them would admit. The leather bundle sat there between them, small, quiet, but carrying a weight that did not belong to its size, and Rick Callahan did not look at it, did not push it closer, did not say a word to guide her toward it. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he knows the truth cannot be handed over, only taken. Margaret finally lowered her hand to the table, fingers brushing the edge of the worn leather, and the contact sent something through her chest, not pain, not fear, something older, something that had been buried with the rest of what she had chosen not to remember. She turned it slightly, enough for the firelight to catch the stitching, and there it was, unmistakable now, a pattern her husband had used, careful and precise, something he had learned from his father before him, something he had never taught anyone else. Her breath slowed, but it did not steady. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and her voice had changed, not louder, not softer, just deeper, like it had found a place inside her she had not used in years. Rick did not answer right away. He leaned back slightly, giving her space that felt intentional, respectful, and something else she could not quite name. "I did not get it," he said after a moment. "It was given." Margaret's fingers tightened just enough to crease the leather, and she opened it slowly, carefully. Like she already knew what she might find but needed to see it anyway, and inside was a small folded piece of cloth, faded, worn thin at the edges, the color dulled by time but still holding the faint trace of something familiar. She unfolded it, revealing a simple patch, stitched by hand, bearing the initials she had not spoken out loud since the day she stopped expecting to hear them again. The fire shifted, casting light across her face, and for a moment Rick saw it, the wall she had built, not breaking, not yet, but cracking just enough to let something through. "He made this," she said, not a question, not needing confirmation, and Rick nodded once, slow, his eyes finally lifting from the fire to meet hers. "He asked me to bring it," he said, and the words settled into the room like something that could not be taken back once spoken. Margaret's gaze held his, searching, measuring, trying to understand how a man who had walked into her yard like a stranger could be carrying something that belonged to a life she had locked away. "When?" she asked, and this time the question mattered more than the answer. Rick looked at the fire again, the light moving in his eyes like it did not want to stay still. "A long time ago," he said, and there was no distance in his voice now, no attempt to soften it, just the truth laid out plain, and that was when Margaret felt it, the shift she had been trying not to name, the sense that this night had not started when he sat by her fire, but much earlier, somewhere she had chosen not to look. Outside, the wind felt quiet again, leaving the cabin wrapped in a stillness that felt heavier than before, and Margaret folded the cloth back into the leather, her hands steady now, too steady, the kind of steady that comes when something inside you has already begun to change. She placed it back on the table, not pushing it away, not pulling it closer, just leaving it there between them, a line neither of them had crossed yet, but both of them understood. "You knew him," she said, and Rick did not look away this time. "Yes," he answered, and that single word carried more than any explanation could have, and Margaret felt the fire at her back, the warmth pressing forward, while something colder moved in from the edges of the room, not fear, not exactly, but the beginning of a truth she was not sure she was ready to hear, and yet could not turn away from any more. Margaret Hale did not break her gaze, not when Rick Callahan said the word yes, not when the fire shifted and cast shadows across his face that made him look older than the night, and not when something inside her began to rearrange itself around a truth she had not yet heard but could already feel pressing in. The leather bundle stayed on the table between them, quiet, patient, like it knew its purpose had only just begun, and Margaret rested her palm flat beside it, not touching it again, but not letting it drift out of reach either. "Then you know why I do not let people sit at my fire," she said, and her voice held no anger, only a weight that had been carried too long to still feel sharp. Rick nodded once, his eyes steady now, no longer avoiding hers, and there was something in that look that did not ask for forgiveness, did not expect it, just accepted whatever came next. "I know enough," he said, and that was not the same as saying everything, and she heard the difference. The wind outside had quieted completely, leaving the kind of stillness that made every small sound feel larger, the crack of wood, the shift of fabric, the breath drawn just a little too slow, and Margaret turned away for a moment, just long enough to look at the photograph on the wall again, the one she had not taken down because forgetting had never been the same as letting go. "He did not trust many men," she said, her eyes still on the image, her younger self beside a man who had once filled this room with something she could not name anymore. "So if he trusted you with this—" She did not finish the thought, because finishing it would mean stepping somewhere she had refused to go. Rick leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees again, the same posture as before, but this time there was tension in it, something held back, something waiting for its moment. "He did not trust me," Rick said quietly. "Not at first." Margaret turned back, her expression tightening just enough to show that she was listening in a way she had not allowed herself to in years. "But he chose you anyway," she said, and there was something in that, something that did not sit easily, because choice meant intention, and intention meant a story she had not been told. Rick's gaze dropped to the floor for a second, then lifted again, and when he spoke, it came slower, like each word had to pass through something before it reached the air. "He said some things are not meant to be carried by the ones who lose them," he said. "Said sometimes it takes a stranger to bring something home." The words settled into the room, and Margaret felt them, not just hearing them, but measuring them against everything she knew, everything she had built to survive the years that followed that loss. "And what did you lose?" she asked, and this time it was not about her husband, not about the past she already knew, it was about him, about the man sitting in her fire like he belonged there but carried something that did not. Rick did not answer right away. He reached for the cup again, though it had long since cooled, and held it in his hands like it still held warmth, like it still had purpose. "Enough," he said finally, and it was the simplest answer he could have given, and somehow the most honest. Margaret studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching but not breaking, and she realized then that whatever had brought him here was not just about returning something that belonged to her, it was about something he had not yet said, something tied to that night years ago in a way she could not see clearly yet, but could feel forming around the edges of this moment. She moved back to her chair, sitting down slowly, her eyes never leaving him, and for the first time since he had arrived, she let the question settle fully between them, no longer held back, no longer softened. "Why now?" she asked, and the fire popped again, sharp in the quiet, as if the night itself had been waiting for that question to be spoken aloud. The question did not echo, but it stayed, resting between them like something that had finally found its place, And Rick Callahan did not look away this time, did not reach for the cup or the fire or anything else that might soften what he was about to say. He just sat there and let the silence hold for one more breath before answering. "Because I ran out of places to put it," he said, and the words came simple, without weight in their sound, but heavy in what they carried, and Margaret Hale felt that difference immediately. She did not respond. She watched him, measuring not the words, but the way he held them, the way his shoulders stayed still, the way his hands did not move to hide anything. "He gave it to me before I left," Rick continued, his voice steady. "Told me if I ever stopped moving, if I ever found a place that felt like it might hold still long enough, I was supposed to bring it back." Margaret's eyes shifted to the leather bundle again, then back to him, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not quite anger, not quite sorrow, something closer to recognition. "And it took you this long to find that place," she said, and it was not an accusation, but it was not forgiveness either. Rick let out a breath, slow, controlled, like he had practiced it over years that had not given him much room to rest. "No," he said. "I found places. I just did not stay." The fire cracked again, a sharp sound in the stillness, and Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers curling around the edge of the wood as if grounding herself in something solid while the rest of the moment shifted. "So why stay now?" she asked, quieter this time, the question no longer pressing forward, but settling in. Rick's gaze moved to the window, to the dark beyond the glass where nothing moved and everything waited, and when he spoke again, it came slower, like each word had to pass through something he had kept closed for a long time. "Because this is the first place that felt like it was already waiting," he said, and the answer did not explain everything, but it did not need to. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, the firelight moving between them, filling the space where silence used to be enough, and she realized then that whatever had brought him here was not just about a promise made years ago. It was about something unfinished, something that had not settled the way it should have. "You keep saying he asked you," she said, her voice steady again, but lower, more precise. "You have not said why." Rick's jaw tightened just enough to notice, and for the first time since he had stepped into her fire, there was hesitation, not fear, but something close to it, something that made the air feel heavier. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, the same posture as before, but now it carried weight. "Because I was there," he said, and the words did not rise, did not fall, they simply landed, and Margaret felt them before she understood them. The room did not change, the fire did not dim, the wind did not return, but something inside her shifted sharply, like a door she had kept closed had just been touched from the other side. She did not speak right away. She did not move. She just watched him, her eyes searching his face for something that would tell her what he meant, and Rick did not look away, did not soften it, did not try to change it into something easier to hear. "You were there," she repeated, and now it was a question, because it had to be, because there were too many ways that sentence could end, and only one of them would let this moment stay where it was. Rick nodded once, slow, and the fire popped again, louder this time, as if the night itself had leaned closer to listen. "Yes," he said, and Margaret's hand moved, not toward the rifle, not toward the door, but toward the table, resting beside the leather bundle again, because whatever came next was not something she could step away from, not anymore, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was waiting. Margaret Hale did not breathe the same way after that word settled between them, not deeper, not faster, just different, as if the air itself had changed weight, and Rick Callahan remained exactly where he was, not reaching for anything, not defending, not explaining beyond what he had already said, because some truths did not come in pieces, they came whole. Or not at all. The fire burned low, steady, indifferent to what had just shifted in the room, and Margaret's eyes stayed on him, searching, not for guilt, not for innocence, but for something harder to name, something that would tell her whether this man belonged in this moment, or not. "You stood there," she said, and it was not accusation, not yet, just the shape of the truth she was trying to see clearly, and Rick nodded once, the motion small, controlled, but it carried more than words. "I stood there," he answered, and he did not look away when he said it, did not soften it, did not try to turn it into something easier to hold. Margaret's hand pressed against the table, fingers steady, though something beneath that steadiness had begun to move, something that had been locked away with the rest of that night she had refused to revisit. "And you did nothing," she said, and now there was something in her voice, not anger, not yet, but a line drawn sharper than before. Rick's jaw tightened, not in defense, but in acknowledgement, and for a moment the silence stretched, heavy, waiting for him to either step away from it or step fully into it. "I did not stop it," he said, and the distinction was small, but it mattered, and Margaret heard it, even if she did not accept it. The wind brushed the cabin again, softer this time, like something that had been listening and decided not to interrupt, and Margaret stood slowly, pushing her chair back with a quiet scrape that sounded louder than it should have, and she took a step toward the fire, not toward him, but closer to the heat, as if she needed something solid between them now. "You expect me to believe that makes a difference?" she asked, and this time the edge was there, thin but real, cutting through the calm she had held on to all night. Rick did not move. He did not follow her, did not close the space she had created, he just sat there and let her have it, because some distances were not meant to be crossed. "No," he said quietly. "I do not expect that." Margaret let out a breath, sharp enough to feel, and she looked at the fire, not at him, watching the flames shift and bend like they were trying to escape something they could not leave behind. "Then why come here?" she said, and now it was not a question, it was something closer to demand, because whatever answer he had given before was no longer enough. Rick leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees again, the same posture, but now it carried something heavier, something closer to the truth he had not fully spoken. "Because I was the one he chose to trust after," he said, and the words settled differently than the ones before, because they reached beyond the moment he had admitted to and into something else, something Margaret had not expected. She turned then, slowly, her eyes finding his again, sharper now, clearer, not clouded by memory but cutting through it. "After what?" she asked, and the room held still again, the fire quieting as if it knew this was the part that mattered most. Rick did not answer right away. He held her gaze steady, unwavering, and when he spoke, it came low, deliberate, each word placed where it could not be taken back. "After he knew he was not coming back from that land dispute," he said, and Margaret felt it then, the shift she had been bracing for without knowing it, the realization that whatever she believed about that night was only part of the story, and that this man sitting in her fire was not just a witness to it, but a piece of it she had never been given. Her hand tightened slightly against the table, not enough to show, but enough to feel, and she did not step away, did not reach for the rifle, did not close the door, because something inside her had already decided that whatever came next, she was going to hear it all the way through, and Rick saw that, not in her words, but in the way she stayed exactly where she was, facing him, the fire between them no longer just warmth, but a line that neither of them could cross without changing everything. Margaret Hale did not look away when Rick Callahan spoke those words, but something in her posture changed, not retreating, not advancing, just settling into a place where she could finally hear what had been kept from her for too long, and the fire between them burned lower now, steady and quiet, as if it had done its work and would leave the rest to them. "He knew," she said, not a question, not disbelief, just a slow unfolding of something she had never been given the chance to understand, and Rick nodded once, his eyes holding hers without hesitation. "He knew," he repeated, and there was no distance in it, no attempt to soften what that meant, and Margaret felt the weight of it settle deeper than anything before. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the photograph again, but this time she did not see it the same way, not as a memory frozen in time, but as a moment that had been missing something she had not known to look for. "He never told me," she said quietly, and there was no anger in it, just the quiet ache of something left unsaid. Rick shifted slightly, his boots brushing against the wooden floor, a small sound that broke the stillness just enough to remind them both that this was happening now, not then. "He did not want you to carry it," Rick said, and Margaret let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, as if the truth had found a place to rest inside her, even if she was not ready to accept it fully. "So he gave it to you instead," she said, and this time there was a sharper edge beneath the calm, because that choice, that decision, had shaped everything that came after. Rick did not deny it. "He said you had already carried enough," he answered, and the words hung there, fragile and heavy at the same time, and Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second, not in pain, not in refusal, but in recognition of the man she had known, the man who would make that choice even if it meant leaving her with questions instead of answers. When she opened them again, she looked at Rick differently, not as a stranger who had walked into her fire, but as someone who had been standing just outside her life all along, unseen, unheard, until now. "So you kept it," she said, and it was not a judgment, not yet, just a statement of fact that needed to be spoken. Rick nodded. "I kept it," he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, not guilt, not exactly, but something close to it, something that had grown heavier over time. "And I kept moving," he added, almost to himself, like he was tracing the path that had led him here. Margaret watched him, her eyes steady, searching not for excuses, but for truth, and she saw it there, in the way he did not look away, in the way he did not try to change what had already been said. "You could have come back sooner," she said, and this time it was not about the past, it was about the years that had followed, the silence that had stretched longer than it should have. Rick's gaze dropped for a moment, then lifted again, and when he spoke, it came quieter, but no less certain. "I did not know how," he said, and it was the kind of answer that sounded simple but carried more than it revealed, because knowing how to return something was not the same as knowing how to face what came with it. The fire gave a soft crack, a small shift in the coals, and Margaret felt it again, that movement inside her, not the sharp edge of anger she had expected, but something slower, something that did not push him away even when it should have. She stepped closer to the table, her hand resting beside the leather bundle once more, and this time she picked it up, not hesitating, not questioning, just holding it in both hands as if it belonged there again. "And now you do," she said, and it was not a question, it was a recognition of the moment they were standing in, and Rick met her gaze, steady, unguarded, as the firelight flickered between them, no longer just a barrier, but something that had drawn them into the same place at the same time, for reasons neither of them could walk away from anymore. Margaret Hale did not answer right away, not because she did not understand what Rick Callahan had just said, but because she understood it too well, and that made it harder, not easier, to respond. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing coals, the flames now low and steady, casting a softer light that blurred the edges of the room and made everything feel closer, more confined, as if the night itself had leaned into. "Listen." Her hand rested on the leather bundle, fingers still, not gripping it, not letting it go, just holding the space it occupied, and she let out a slow breath that carried more than just air. "So you brought it back to ease your own burden," she said, and her voice did not accuse, but it did not forgive either, it simply placed the truth where it could be seen. Rick did not flinch at the words. He had expected them, maybe even needed them. "Part of it," he admitted, his tone steady, honest in a way that did not try to hide behind anything else. Margaret's eyes stayed on him, searching, measuring, deciding, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them not empty, but full of everything that had not been said yet. "And the other part?" she asked, quieter now, her voice no longer pressing, but pulling. Rick leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, as if the hardest part had already been spoken, and what remained was simply the rest of it. "The other part is what he asked me to do," he said. "Not just to bring it back, but to tell you what he could not." The words settled into the room, and Margaret felt them land somewhere deeper than the rest, somewhere she had kept closed for years without knowing it. She looked down at the bundle again, then back at him, and there was something in her expression now that had changed, not softened, not yet, but opened just enough to let something through. "Then tell me," she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance, just a quiet demand for the truth she had been denied. Rick held her gaze, steady and unguarded, and for a moment it seemed like he might look away, like he might choose silence over what came next, but he did not. He said he was not afraid of losing the land. Rick began, his voice low, measured. Said land comes and goes. But he was afraid of leaving you with questions he could not answer. Margaret's breath caught, just slightly, not enough to show, but enough to feel, and she did not look away. He said if anything happened, if things did not go the way he hoped, I was to make sure you knew he did. Not walk into it blind. Rick continued. He chose to stand where he stood because he believed it was the only way to keep things from getting worse. The fire shifted again, a small crack that echoed louder than it should have, and Margaret felt something inside her shift with it, something she had held onto for years beginning to loosen, not breaking, not yet, but moving. He chose it. She said softly, more to herself than to Rick, and the words carried a different weight now, not just loss, but understanding. Rick nodded once. He chose it. He repeated, and there was no judgment in his voice, no attempt to change what that meant, just the truth laid out where it could be seen. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, the image of the man in the photograph no longer frozen in time, but moving, choosing, deciding in ways she had never been given the chance to see. When she opened them again, she looked at Rick differently, not as the man who had carried this for years, not as the one who had stood there that night, but as the one who had come back to finish something that had been left undone. And you, she said, her voice steady again, grounded. What did you choose? Rick did not answer immediately. He looked at the fire, at the last of the glowing coals, and when he spoke, it came quieter than before, but no less certain. I chose to stay this time, he said, and the words did not fill the room, they settled into it, leaving Margaret to decide what they meant, and whether they were enough. Margaret Hale did not react the way Rick Callahan might have expected when he said he chose to stay. There was no immediate answer, no softening in her eyes, no step closer or further away, just a long, steady silence that seemed to stretch across the years between them and settle into the present like it had always belonged there. The coals in the hearth glowed faint now, their light low and patient, casting a dim warmth that no longer filled the room but lingered just enough to hold it together, and Margaret remained where she stood, one hand resting near the leather bundle, the other hanging at her side, relaxed but not without tension. You say that like it means something, she said at last, her voice calm, almost even, but there was something beneath it, something measured, as if she was weighing his words against everything she had learned not to trust. Rick did not shift, did not defend it, did not try to make it sound like more than it was. It does to me, he answered quietly, and that was all, no explanation, no promise, just a statement that stood on its own. Margaret watched him, her eyes searching for something she could hold on to, something that would tell her whether this was a man passing through or a man who understood what it meant to stay, and she did not find certainty, but she found something else, something closer to honesty than she had seen in a long time. Staying is not the same as belonging, she said, and the words came without force, but they carried weight, because they were not about him, not entirely, they were about her, about the space she had built and the lines she had drawn. Rick nodded once, accepting it without argument. I know, he said, and for the first time there was a trace of something in his voice that had not been there before, not doubt, not regret, but something like understanding that had been earned, not given. The wind outside brushed softly against the cabin again, a quieter sound now, as if the night itself had settled into the rhythm of what was unfolding inside, and Margaret turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the door, not to leave, not to close it, but just to acknowledge it was there, still open, still allowing something in. She stepped away from the table slowly, moving toward the hearth, and with a small motion she reached for a piece of wood stacked beside it, placing it gently onto the coals, not to restart the fire, but to keep it from fading entirely. The flame caught slowly, hesitant at first, then steady, and she watched it for a moment before speaking again. You stayed all this time carrying something that was never yours, she said, her back still to him, her voice quieter now, more inward than before. And now you are asking me to carry it with you. Rick did not answer immediately. He let the truth of that sit where it was, did not deny it, did not soften it, and when he finally spoke, it came low, steady, like everything else he had said. I am not asking you to carry it, he said. I am asking you to decide what to do with it. Margaret stood still, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the hearth, the warmth of the fire returning slowly, and she felt that shift again, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like something long buried beginning to breathe again. She turned back to face him, her eyes clear, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but not resolved either, just present in a way she had not allowed herself to be for years. And if I decide to let it go? She asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. What happens to you then? Rick held her eyes, did not look away, did not hesitate, and for a moment the room felt smaller again, the fire brighter, the night quieter, as if everything had narrowed down to this single question. Then I will have nothing left tying me here, he said, and there was no fear in it, no plea, just truth, simple and complete, and Margaret felt the weight of it settle in, not as something to resist, but as something she had to face, because for the first time since he had arrived, she understood that whatever she chose next would not just shape her past, it would shape what came after, for both of them. Margaret Hale did not answer him right away, not after he said that nothing would tie him there if she chose to let it go, because that was not just his truth, it had become hers without her noticing, and the weight of that realization settled slower than anything else that had been said that night. The fire behind her began to rise again, the new piece of wood catching, sending a soft crackle through the room that felt almost like a breath returning after being held too long, and she turned slightly toward it, not to avoid him, but to give herself a moment to stand somewhere familiar while everything else shifted. Her hand rested on the edge of the hearth, fingers feeling the warmth, grounding herself in something that did not change with words or memories. You think this is about letting go? She said quietly, her voice not sharp, not distant, just steady, as if she had finally reached a place where she could speak without guarding every word. Rick Callahan did not move. He watched her, not with expectation, not with hope, just with the same stillness he had carried since the beginning, the kind that allowed space instead of filling it. Is it not? He asked, and the question was simple, but it did not push, it waited. Margaret let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting to the photograph again, but this time she did not linger there, she did not hold on to it the way she once had, she just acknowledged it before looking back at him. Letting go would have been easier, she said. I tried that. The words came without hesitation, and for the first time that night, there was something in them that belonged fully to her, not shaped by what he had brought, not influenced by what he had said. But it never left. She continued, her voice steady, grounded. It just stayed quiet. The fire shifted again, the flame growing stronger, pushing shadows back from the walls, and Margaret stepped away from the hearth, moving back toward the table where the leather bundle rested, her steps slow but certain, not cautious anymore, not uncertain. She picked it up again, holding it in both hands, feeling its weight as if it had changed since the last time, though she knew it had not. You carried this thinking it was yours to bring back, she said, her eyes on the bundle, then lifting to meet his. But it was never yours to decide when. Rick held her gaze, and for the first time, there was a shift in him, not in posture, not in movement, but in something quieter, something that acknowledged what she was saying without needing to answer it. You are right, he said, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to hold on to control of something that had already moved beyond him. Margaret nodded once, not as agreement, but as recognition that the truth had finally settled where it belonged. She turned then, walking toward the door, not quickly, not with urgency, just with purpose, and when she reached it, she pushed it open wider, letting the cool night air drift in, mixing with the warmth of the fire. Behind her, the land outside stretched quiet and still, the same land that had held her alone for years, the same land that had witnessed everything without saying a word. She stepped just past the threshold, the dirt under her boots firm and familiar, and for a moment she stood there, looking out into the dark, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just standing in it. Rick did not follow. He stayed where he was, inside the circle of firelight, watching her from where he sat, understanding without being told that this was not a moment he could step into. Margaret lowered her gaze to the bundle in her hands, her fingers tightening just slightly, and then she did something neither of them had expected when the night began. She set it down on the porch beside the door, not tossing it, not discarding it, just placing it there, outside, where the night could take it or leave it as it chose. She did not look back immediately. She let the silence settle around that choice, let the air move through it, and when she finally turned, her eyes found Rick again, steady, clear, no longer searching for answers, because she had made her decision. "It does not belong to either of us," she said, her voice calm, certain. "It belongs to the past." The fire crackled behind him, the night breathed around her, and in that moment, something shifted that neither of them could undo, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet and final in a way that left no room for doubt. Margaret Hale stood at the threshold a moment longer, the night air brushing against her face like something familiar that had waited patiently for her to return. And behind her, the fire inside the cabin burned steady again, no longer fading, no longer struggling, just present in a way it had not been when the night began. Rick Callahan did not move from where he sat, but something in him had shifted, not outwardly, not in posture or breath, but in the quiet understanding that whatever had been carried across miles and years had finally reached the place it was meant to rest, even if it was no longer in his hands. Margaret turned slowly, stepping back inside, leaving the door open. Behind her, not as an invitation, not as a signal, but simply because she no longer felt the need to close it, and that alone carried more meaning than anything she could have said. She moved past the table, past the place where the leather bundle had rested between them, and returned to the hearth, lowering herself into the chair she had left earlier, her movements calm, deliberate, unchanged on the surface, but lighter in a way that did not show until you looked closely. Rick watched her, not with expectation, not with hope, just with the same steady presence he had held all night, waiting not for permission, but for whatever came next. The silence between them returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It no longer pressed or guarded, it simply existed, like the land outside, wide and patient, holding what it needed to without asking for more. Margaret rested her hands in her lap, her eyes on the fire, following the slow rise and fall of the flames as they settled into a rhythm that felt almost like breathing, and for the first time in years, she did not see it as something to keep the past away, but as something that could hold both what had been and what might still come. "You said you chose to stay," she said after a while, her voice quiet, not breaking the silence, but moving through it. Rick nodded once, his gaze steady. "I did," he answered. Margaret did not look at him right away. She let the words sit, let them find their place the way everything else had tonight, and then she reached for another piece of wood beside the hearth, placing it gently onto the fire, watching as the flame caught and grew, steady and sure. "Then you stay," she said, and there was no weight in the words, no condition, no demand, just a simple acknowledgement of what was now his to decide. Rick did not speak. He did not need to. The answer was already there, in the way he remained seated, in the way he did not reach for his coat or glance toward the door, in the way the stillness around him had finally settled into something that no longer felt temporary. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land, brushing past the porch where the leather bundle rested. Untouched, left where it belonged, no longer carried by either of them, no longer needing to be. Margaret's gaze drifted once more to the photograph on the wall. But this time she did not hold on to it, she did not measure it against the present, she simply let it be what it was, a part of her story, not the whole of it. The fire crackled gently, filling the room with warmth that did not demand anything in return, and Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her shoulders easing in a way they had not in years, not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer held the same weight. Rick sat across from her, quiet, steady, no longer a stranger, not fully something else yet either, but present in a way that mattered more than any name or role. The night stretched on, calm and unbroken, and in that quiet, with the door left open and the fire burning steady between them, something new settled into place, not spoken, not promised, just there, like the first light that comes before dawn, unseen but certain, waiting for its time.